Oh dear ladies and gentlemen, a woman with no friends. There was once a woman, not famous, not beautiful in the way the world would notice. She wasn't the life of the party because she was never invited. She walked alone, no friends, not one. Oh, people passed her by, yes, they looked but they never saw. And what's worse than being ignored is being invisible. You see, this woman didn't laugh often. She didn't have a hand to hold when the nights were long. She didn't have anyone to call when her heart was breaking. She sat in the back row, at church, at life. She was a woman with no friends, not because she chose solitude, but because life had carved out a lonely path for her. People often misunderstand that kind of loneliness. They assume it's the result of bitterness, of being unkind, or of shutting others out. But this woman, oh, she had tried. She had opened her heart again and again, only to be met with silence, with indifference, with doors gently closed in her face. She had sent the invitations, extended the handshakes, smiled when it hurt to smile, hoping someone, just one soul, would see past the surface and choose to stay. But no one did. There's a certain ache that grows in the heart of a person who has no one to talk to when the tears fall. She didn't need a crowd, didn't need applause or admiration. She just longed for one voice in the dark who would say, "I see you." She watched others gather, families laughing in restaurants, groups of friends in church pews sharing whispered jokes, sisters with arms entwined walking down the street. She watched and she wondered what it would feel like to be wanted. Not needed for what she could give, not tolerated out of pity, but wanted, cherished. Remember, her days were quiet, her nights were quieter. And in the stillness she questioned herself. Was she too strange, too broken? Had she said something wrong? Had she been born with something missing? Something everyone else seemed to have, something that made them magnetic, likable, welcome. It wasn't that she didn't love people. She loved deeply, but her love never seemed to be returned. Her messages went unread. Her smiles met blank stares. Birthdays came and went with no calls. It was as though she lived behind glass, visible, yet unreachable. She tried to make peace with it, this life of solitude. She told herself she was strong, independent, that she didn't need anyone. But strength wasn't what she really wanted. She wanted connection. And every time she said she was fine, she hoped someone would notice the tremble in her voice. No one did. Her loneliness was not loud. It was quiet, subtle, disguised beneath routine and politeness. But it was heavy, so heavy, and it grew heavier with each passing year. She carried it with grace, but grace doesn't erase pain, it holds it, and she held it like a sacred thing, too proud to show, too deep to explain. Sometimes when she passed her reflection in a window, she didn't recognize the woman staring back, not because her face had changed, but because she no longer saw the fire she once had. The light had dimmed, not gone out, but dimmed, all because the heart wasn't made to walk alone. What many never knew was that this woman with no friends, was filled with compassion. She could read a room and feel who was hurting. She would have been the best friend, the truest confidante. She didn't judge, she listened. She had a way of making others feel safe, but no one ever gave her the chance to show it. People rarely look deeper than what they first see, and what they saw they misunderstood. They saw silence and thought she was cold. They saw solitude and thought she was proud. They saw sadness and mistook it for weakness. But what they didn't see was the quiet strength it took to show up every day alone. The courage it took to keep hoping. The resilience it took to believe that, maybe someday, someone would choose her. Someone would stay. She had a smile that didn't always reach her eyes. People would say, "She's quiet but sweet," and leave it at that, never asking why her voice always seemed to hesitate at the edge of conversation. She wasn't born shy. Life had taught her to retreat. Every time she stepped forward, it seemed the world stepped back. So, over time, she learned to speak less, to expect less, to hope less. That kind of withdrawal doesn't happen all at once. It's slow, like a tide receding inch by inch, until one day, she looked around and realized no one was standing beside her anymore. She remembered when she used to be full of words, full of stories, laughter, dreams. There was a time when she believed everyone had a place, and hers would be found among friends who knew her deeply. But with every unanswered message, every plan cancelled at the last minute, every moment when her presence went unnoticed, her belief began to fade. She stopped initiating, not because she didn't care, but because rejection, when it repeats itself long enough, begins to echo louder than invitation. Eventually silence felt safer. She watched people form circles, watched them gather in the warmth of shared connection, and she stood outside those circles, smiling politely but feeling like a ghost. Her presence was there but never truly felt. She could be in a room full of people and feel the ache of isolation more profoundly than if she had stayed home. That ache wasn't about being alone. It was about being unseen, invisible. not in body but in spirit. She carried conversations, remembered birthdays, asked how others were doing, but rarely did the questions return. Her kindness wasn't mirrored. Her effort was never reciprocated. Still, she showed up. That's what made her different. She didn't disappear in bitterness. She didn't let loneliness make her cruel. She kept showing up for people. She smiled even when her heart was weary. She celebrated others even when she herself felt forgotten. But that silent giving, that quiet endurance, often went unrecognized. People grew used to her steadiness. They assumed she didn't need anything in return. They mistook her silence for strength, her solitude for choice. But inside she was breaking, not loudly, not dramatically, just little pieces at a time. There were nights she stared at her phone, wondering if it would light up with a simple, "Are you okay?" It rarely did. And when it did, it was often too late. The moment had passed, the need had grown cold. She knew how to comfort herself. She knew how to pull herself back up. But just because she could do it alone didn't mean she wanted to. Just because she didn't complain didn't mean she wasn't hurting. People forget that the strongest faces can mask the most fragile hearts. She prayed in the dark, sometimes with words, sometimes only with tears, because there are things too deep for language, aches that can't be explained. She knew how to make peace with silence, but peace doesn't always mean happiness. Sometimes peace is just surrender. She surrendered to the quiet, to the stillness, to the reality that not everyone finds a friend. Not every story is full of reunion and laughter. Some stories are written in solitude, and she had learned to read hers line by line. She wasn't bitter. That's what made her beautiful in a way that few could understand. She had every reason to give up on love, on kindness, on people. But she didn't. She still held the door open. She still left room at her table. Even when no one came, she prepared a place, just in case. Because somewhere deep inside, she still believed in the goodness of connection. She still believed that maybe one day someone would see her and choose to stay. She often walked with her head slightly lowered, not out of shame, but out of habit. When a person has been overlooked enough times, they start expecting it. She wasn't bitter about it, not anymore. She had simply adapted. She became used to being the one people forgot to invite, the one who always seemed to be on the outskirts. She could be in the same place as everyone else, but somehow, she remained apart. People spoke over her, around her, but rarely to her. She noticed it, of course she noticed. But she stopped mentioning it, because pointing it out never changed anything. It only made things more awkward. She learned how to blend into the background, to be present but not intrusive, available but never in the way. Her presence became something others grew used to, like the sound of the wind or the ticking of a clock, there but rarely acknowledged. And in that invisibility she learned how to observe. She saw everything. She noticed the flicker of pain behind a forced smile. She saw the way people clung to their phones in a room full of silence. She picked up on every shift in mood, every unspoken ache. Because when you spend so much time outside the noise, you become attuned to the things others miss. She had the kind of soul that remembered everything. The things others casually mentioned in passing, she remembered them. The dreams, the worries, the little victories. And even though she had no one to share her life with, she celebrated theirs, quietly from afar. She clapped for their progress, prayed for their peace, rooted for their joy. Even when they never thought to include her in the journey, she still watched with love. There was no bitterness in her spirit, just a longing that never fully left her. She lived a life that many wouldn't understand, a life where birthdays were silent, holidays were quiet, achievements were clapped for only in her own heart. She learned how to encourage herself, how to be both her own support and her own celebration. And though she longed for shared laughter, for late-night talks, for someone to notice when she was not okay, she never let the absence of those things harden her. She didn't build walls. She kept her heart open, even if it meant enduring the sting of neglect. Sometimes she would sit in public places just to hear the noise of life, just to feel connected in some small way. She watched children laugh, lovers hold hands, old friends share stories. She watched and wondered what it would feel like to be chosen, to be thought of first instead of last, or not at all. She wondered what it would be like to get a message that didn't ask for something, but simply said, "I miss you." That kind of love, the simple, unasked for kind, always felt like a miracle to her. She didn't wear her loneliness like a badge. She dressed with care, carried herself with grace, smiled when she could. People assumed she had it all together. But they didn't see the moments when she cried quietly in the kitchen, when she turned off the lights and sat in the dark, just to feel something other than numb. They didn't see the effort it took to keep showing up, to keep believing that maybe she mattered, even if no one said it out loud. There was so much beauty in her spirit, but it was hidden beneath layers of silence. She loved deeply even if she was never loved in return. She gave freely even if nothing came back. And in a world that celebrates the loud and the popular, she remained unseen. Yet her heart still whispered hope in the silence, not because she had reason to, but because hope was the only thing she knew how to hold on to. There were moments, simple, ordinary moments, when she felt the weight of her own silence more than usual. Walking through a grocery store aisle, standing in line at the bank, sitting by the window with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. It wasn't the big things that broke her, it was the small ones. The kind of moments where others had someone to share a glance with, someone to turn to and say, "Did you see that?" Or "Remember when?" She didn't have that. The world passed her by, and she moved through it like a shadow, present, but never quite part of anything. She learned to keep her thoughts inside, not because she lacked anything to say, but because no one ever asked. There was a whole world within her, memories, ideas, questions, laughter, pain, but it stayed locked away, not out of fear, but out of habit. When no one knocks on the door, you stop expecting visitors. She became comfortable with her own voice echoing back at her in empty rooms, comfortable with not being asked how her day was, comfortable with cooking for one, eating in silence, cleaning up the same solitary mess. She didn't hate it, but she didn't love it either. It just was. She often felt like she was watching life through a window, like a spectator in a world that didn't quite notice she existed. People came and went with their plans and their people, their circles tight and full. She didn't envy them, not in the bitter, jealous way. She just wondered what that kind of belonging felt like. The kind where you don't have to try so hard. The kind where you can just show up and that's enough. She had never known that kind of ease with others. For her, every relationship was work, every connection fragile, every goodbye inevitable. And yet she still hoped. That was the part that surprised even her sometimes. Despite everything, she still carried a quiet hope that someone someday would choose to stay. She never stopped believing in the possibility of connection, even when reality told her otherwise. She would smile at strangers, hold doors open, send kind messages into the void, not because she expected anything in return, but because that was who she was. She couldn't stop loving, even in the absence of love returned. She couldn't stop giving, even when she had nothing left to give. She was the kind of woman who noticed the lonely ones. The ones who sat alone, the ones who spoke softly, the ones who looked like they were trying not to cry. She recognized them because she was them. She had a tenderness that came from knowing what it felt like to be overlooked. And though the world often passed her by, she refused to do the same to others. She made room in her heart for people who never made room for her. That was her quiet strength. That was her silent gift. There were days when the silence wrapped around her like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. When the thought of another weekend with no plans felt too heavy to bear. When even the sunniest afternoons couldn't warm the cold ache inside. But still, she got up. Still, she made her bed. Still, she showed up to life. It wasn't about grand victories. It was about the quiet, unseen choice to keep moving, to keep living, to keep hoping. She didn't talk much about how hard it was. She didn't know how. People rarely want to hear about the ache that sits in the chest like a stone. They want inspiration, not vulnerability. So she kept it inside. Smiled when she had to. Laughed when she could. And in the spaces between, she held herself together. She had mastered the art of pretending. To the outside world, she appeared composed, reliable, always in control. She didn't cause scenes, didn't demand attention, didn't fall apart in front of anyone. She wore a calm face like a uniform, neat, appropriate, undisturbed. People assumed she was fine because she didn't complain. She nodded at the right times, smiled in all the right moments, and said, "I'm good," with the kind of steadiness that convinced even herself for a while. But behind that calm exterior was a storm that never truly ended. There were nights her pillow was soaked with tears no one would ever see. Mornings she woke up wondering if anyone would notice if she simply stopped showing up. She was the kind of woman who people remembered only when they needed something. A helping hand, a listening ear, a quiet place to rest their burdens. And she gave freely every single time. Not because she had to, but because it was in her nature. She couldn't turn away someone who was hurting. Even when her own heart was fragile, even when her own spirit was drained, she made space for others. She didn't keep score, she didn't ask for anything in return. But deep down, there was a longing she didn't often speak of, a longing to be on the receiving end of what she so often gave. She had learned how to care without being cared for. She had grown accustomed to offering warmth without ever being wrapped in it. It wasn't that she expected grand gestures or elaborate words. She would have been content with someone simply asking, "How are you, really?" and waiting long enough to hear the truth. She wasn't hard to love, but she was often overlooked. People mistook her quietness for having no need. They assumed she was okay because she didn't fall apart in front of them. But strength can be deceptive, especially the kind built from repeated disappointment. There were times she questioned whether she was doing something wrong, whether there was something in her that made people keep their distance. She looked in the mirror and tried to find the flaw that repelled closeness. Was it her softness, her seriousness, her silence? But the truth wasn't in what she lacked. It was in what others failed to see. She was deep water in a world that preferred the shallow. She didn't fit neatly into quick conversations and casual friendships. She needed depth, honesty, presence, and most people didn't know how to give that. Still, she kept her heart open. Even after being left, forgotten, ignored, she kept showing up with love. Her soul bore scars, some faded, some still aching. But she didn't let them turn into walls. She didn't close off the parts of herself that ached to be known. She remained honest. She remained tender. She remained hopeful. And that, more than anything, was her quiet defiance in a world that rarely noticed. People came to her when their world was falling apart. And she would listen. She would comfort. She would hold space without judgment. But when she needed someone, when her world began to crumble, there was often no one there. The phone stayed silent. The room stayed empty. And she would sit alone, piecing herself back together with the same hands that had held so many others. She had become an expert at healing wounds she didn't cause, especially the ones in her own heart. There was a tiredness in her, not the kind that sleep could fix, but the kind born from years of being strong for everyone else. It weighed on her in invisible ways, and yet she never used it as a reason to withhold her kindness. She never let her weariness spill over onto others. She continued to pour out love, even when her own cup was empty. It wasn't about being selfless. It was about being true to who she was. She couldn't stop loving, even if the love she gave was never returned. She often wondered if anyone noticed, if anyone saw the quiet sacrifice she made just to keep moving, to keep offering, to keep loving. She didn't need recognition, but she longed for someone to say, "I see you. I see what you do. I see how you love." Not out of pity, but out of understanding. Just a small gesture, little acknowledgement. That was all. Because even the strongest hearts need to be reminded that they matter. Even the loneliest souls need to be held. She didn't want to be dramatic. She didn't want to be a burden. That's why she stayed quiet. That's why she never said just how deep the loneliness had grown, how often it followed her from room to room like a shadow that never lifted. She could be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. It wasn't about physical presence, it was about connection. Real soul-level connection. And she hadn't felt that in so long. She began to wonder if she ever truly had. What she craved wasn't noise or crowds. It was to be known, to be seen beneath the surface, to be understood without explanation. She walked through life meeting needs that were never hers to carry, tending to others like a gentle nurse who never once stops to dress her own wounds. Her kindness became expected. Her listening ear became a given. People poured their hearts out to her, knowing she would never interrupt, never dismiss their pain. She carried those stories with grace, even while her own story remained untold. She knew how to make space for others, but no one ever quite knew how to make space for her. They thought she was strong, and maybe she was. But strength, in her case, came from necessity, not abundance. She had no one to lean on, so she learned to stand. There were moments she wanted to speak up, to say, "I'm not okay." To ask someone to stay a little longer, to say, "Can I talk now? Can you listen this time?" But the words always caught in her throat. She didn't know how to begin. She feared the look of discomfort in someone's eyes if she ever let the truth spill out. So instead, she swallowed it. The hurt, the questions, the disappointment. All of it, swallowed whole and buried deep. She became so good at it that even she forgot what it felt like to be fully honest. She had dreams once, vivid and hopeful. She pictured a life filled with deep friendships, with shared meals and laughter echoing through rooms. She imagined late-night conversations and people who knew her favorite songs, her quiet fears, her strange sense of humor. She imagined someone who would remember the small things. But as time went on, those dreams faded into something softer, more resigned. She stopped expecting so much. She learned to live with the ache, to make peace with the quiet. Her world became smaller, but she still held on to a kind of quiet beauty in the little things. A warm cup of tea, a walk beneath the sky, the sound of wind in the trees. There was a deep reservoir inside her, made from years of love she had no place to give. She had so much to offer. Compassion, loyalty, presence, but few ever stayed long enough to see that. And when they did come close, they often pulled away, unable to recognize the treasure hidden beneath her silence. Still, she remained soft. She refused to let the world harden her. She would rather be overlooked than lose the part of herself that still believed in kindness. She had a softness that the world often mistook for weakness. She wasn't loud, and she didn't demand to be seen, but she was present, steadily, consistently, quietly. Her strength wasn't in her voice but in her endurance, in the way she stayed kind in a world that didn't always give kindness back. She was the type of woman who would notice when someone's eyes looked tired, who would offer a smile even when her own heart was heavy. She never tried to draw attention to herself, and because of that, people often missed her entirely. But she noticed everything. She always had. There was something sacred about the way she walked through life, tender, attentive, careful not to hurt others, even when she was hurting. She carried pain with grace, never letting it leak onto those around her. People would lean on her, cry in front of her, call her in their worst moments. She would hold their words, their fears, their tears like precious things. And when the moment passed, they would walk away lighter, freer, while she was left holding the weight they'd left behind. She never blamed them. She just wished, sometimes, that someone would stay. Not just during the storm, but afterward. Not just when they needed her, but when she needed them. She didn't want attention. She wanted connection, real, grounded connection. The kind where silence is comfortable, and you don't have to prove your worth to be welcome. She longed for someone who would sit with her, without needing her to explain herself. Someone who wouldn't rush in to fix her pain but would be willing to simply be near it. She didn't want answers. She wanted presence. A hand to hold, a shoulder to lean on, a voice to say, "You don't have to go through this alone." But those voices were few, and most of the time, they were silent. She had learned how to live with that silence, how to comfort herself when no one else came, how to speak encouragement into her own soul when the world went quiet. It wasn't a choice born of pride but of necessity. When no one sees the depth of what you carry, you either let it break you, or you learn how to carry it differently. She had chosen to carry it, not with bitterness, but with a kind of weary dignity. She didn't collapse under the weight. She learned how to stand in it. There were times she wondered if people saw her as a person or only as a resource. Someone to go to, but not someone to stay for. Someone to rely on, but not someone to cherish. And those thoughts would sting, not because she wanted to be praised or admired, but because she wanted to be valued. Simply, sincerely, and consistently. She didn't need grand gestures. She just wanted to be remembered, to be thought of, to have someone reach out, not because they needed something, but because they missed her. Even in her loneliness, she never stopped believing that love existed. She saw it in small things. A child laughing, a bird building a nest, a stranger holding the door. She paid attention to those moments. They were reminders. She clung to those soft glimpses of goodness, even when everything else felt uncertain. Because somewhere inside her, there was still that girl who believed in miracles, in friendships that lasted, in love that stayed. And no matter how many times life proved otherwise, that little belief never fully went out. She never let the world decide who she would become. She chose to stay soft, to stay open, to stay hopeful. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. Because even if she walked alone, she refused to walk without love. She often found herself drawn to quiet places, fields just before dusk, empty church pews, back corners of coffee shops where the hum of conversation didn't quite reach. It wasn't because she didn't want to be seen, but because those were the spaces where she could hear her own thoughts clearly. In a world that moved too fast, too loud, too distracted, she craved the stillness. And in that stillness, she would reflect, not just on her own life, but on the people who had passed through it, the ones who stayed for a moment and then vanished like mist. She never chased after them. She had learned long ago that if someone didn't see your worth, chasing them only dimmed your own light. There was a depth to her that couldn't be captured in small talk or surface-level smiles. She had seen things, felt things, carried things that most couldn't begin to understand. And yet, she never used her pain as a reason to harden herself. If anything, it made her more compassionate. She could walk into a room and know, almost instinctively, who was hurting. Not because they said it, but because she recognized the silence behind their eyes. She knew what it looked like to keep going when the soul was tired. She knew what it felt like to be surrounded by people and still feel like no one was really with you. She didn't talk much about her past, not because it wasn't worth sharing, but because no one ever really asked. And when they did, it was often in passing, without the intention of truly listening. So she kept her stories tucked away, like pages in a journal that no one had ever read. Stories of love that never bloomed, of friendships that dissolved without warning, of seasons spent pouring into others only to be left empty. They were sacred, those stories. And even if no one else valued them, she did, because they had shaped her. They had carved into her the kind of beauty that only sorrow can create. She wasn't afraid of being alone. What unsettled her was being unseen, being in a room and feeling like a ghost, being surrounded by laughter that didn't include her, by conversations where her voice was never invited. She watched others form bonds with ease and wondered what secret ingredient she lacked. She didn't want to force herself into circles where she wasn't welcome, but she did long for a space to belong, a table where her presence was not only accepted, but wanted. She wasn't asking for the world, just a hand to hold, a name spoken with affection, a message that said, "I thought of you today." And in the absence of those things, she created her own comfort. She became her own home. She lit candles, wrote her heart out in notebooks, took long walks and whispered prayers under her breath. She learned to celebrate her own victories, no matter how small, making it through the day without crying, speaking up when her voice trembled, smiling at a stranger even when her heart felt hollow. These were not things the world would praise, but they mattered to her. They were proof that she was still fighting, still hoping, still choosing to show up. There was something extraordinary about the way she kept going. Not loudly, not dramatically, but faithfully. She didn't seek applause. She didn't need to be admired. She just wanted to live in a way that stayed true to her heart. And even though life had not given her the friendships or the closeness she had once dreamed of, she hadn't let it take away her belief in the goodness of people. She still held on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, someone out there was looking for a soul like hers. Someone who wouldn't be frightened by her quiet depth or her aching tenderness. And so, if you were to pass by her, you might not notice her at first. You might see only the calm face, the quiet step, the gentle smile that gives more than it ever asks for. But if you looked a little closer, you'd see a woman who has walked through lone lines without losing her ability to love. A woman who, in the absence of friendship, became a friend to the forgotten. Who, when no arms reached for her, kept her own arms open. She is not bitter. She is not broken. She is proof that even a woman with no friends can carry a heart full of grace, a soul still reaching for light, and a love that flows without condition. Let the world take note, in silence does not mean emptiness, and solitude does not mean failure. Sometimes it means strength. Sometimes it means faith. Sometimes it means a miracle in the making.